r/Nosleep. Posted by u/spaghetti_Mercury. The Mennonite Murders. Part 1. Have you ever seen blood in the snow? There's something about it. It's almost pretty. It tries to spread like a cloud in the water, but can only reach so far. The crimson red against the pale white surface almost seems to glow, it is so vibrant. It's something I never expected to see, and never did see until I moved from the dangerous city to a quiet, safe, small town. I'm Alex. My fiancée, Annie, and I have lived in Philadelphia most of our lives. We often discussed moving to a small, quaint area where you have privacy and a feeling of safety. The kind of place where you know your neighbors. After COVID, we were both working remotely, so we had our chance. Eventually, we found a good deal on a nice little house in a quiet neighborhood in northern Pennsylvania. It was a way nicer place than we could afford closer to the city. We decided to pull the trigger. Small town is a bit of an understatement. There are only 5 or 6 households in our little county. You'd have to drive about 20 minutes through back roads and forest until seeing another house. It's a drive we've had to make a couple times because we have to go to town for a lot of grocery shopping and other things. There's a small gas station walking distance from our new house, but it's a very small place with one pump and a small general store. It's not a Dollar General, just a general store. That's how small this area is. Not even a Dollar General. There are some things we can get at the general store, but every now and then we have to make the trip into town. Our neighbors have started carpooling with us into town. It saves gas for us all to go together, but that isn't the reason. The real reason is that they are Amish. In fact, everyone in the county and our little neighborhood are Amish, except for us and the owner of the general store. We quickly befriended our closest neighbors, Seth and Heidi. Annie and I grew accustomed to our new community. We really enjoyed living there before the storm hit. We like having our little general store in walking distance. The owner, Ben, would even serve drinks after hours there. It became a sort of nightly tradition to have a nightcap at the store. But as I said, this was before the storm hit. It happened a few weeks ago. The winter was getting colder by the day. We constantly worried about the families that didn't use electricity. They were tougher than us though. We did get Seth and Heidi to agree to hold on to a couple walkie-talkies in case of emergency. Mainly if someone needed a ride to the hospital or something like that, they'd be able to get a hold of us or Ben. We expected a snowstorm during the week, but it seemed to have missed us. We had no idea that it was only running late. Friday night, I didn't have a care in the world. I was at the store pretty late with Ben, Seth, and Heidi. Annie went to bed early, but she didn't get much sleep. When I woke up the following morning, Annie was wide awake and looked nervous. "What's going on? Did you have a bad dream?" I asked. "I heard noises outside last night. It sounded like someone was out there," she replied. "It might have been me coming back from the store. I'm sorry if I woke you up." "No, it was after you went to bed," she said. "I woke up and heard something rustling out there." "It's probably just forest noises and whatnot," I said, trying to put her mind at ease. "We're used to the white noise of the city. It's so loud that you don't hear the individual sounds outside. Out here, you hear the animals, tree branches breaking in the wind blowing something over, critters, etc." She agreed, but still seemed nervous. It was like she wanted to shrug it off, but couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was wrong. As we were having our morning coffee, Ben called on the walkie. With cell service being scarce here, and so many people in the community not having phones, walkie-talkies have quickly become the go-to source of communication. "We've got some weather coming," Ben said. "I thought it missed us," I replied. "So did I," said Ben. "As bad as we thought it was gonna be the other day?" I asked. "Starting to look like it might be worse," Ben replied. "I'll head over in a minute here. Just let me finish my coffee." Before heading over to the store, I wanted to make sure we had enough gas for the generators in case the power went out. When I went out back to the shed, the can was knocked over and empty. It was strange. I had just filled it. I figured an animal must have gotten in there, but too much snow had fallen to see any prints. Maybe that's what Annie heard the night before. I grabbed the gas can and went to the store to meet Ben. We knew we had to check on the Amish families, make sure they were aware of the bad weather coming, and check and see if they needed help preparing for it. I walked into the general store and saw that Seth was already there, talking with Ben. "Big storm coming," Seth said. "I heard. You guys are welcome to stay with us if you don't feel like running the generator all night," I said. "We're prepared," Seth replied. "Have you seen David or Sarah?" Ben asked. "I haven't seen anyone today," I said. Are they the family that lives around the corner? I asked. Yeah, the Amish folks, Ben laughed. I'm trying to warn everyone about the storm, but they haven't responded. Are they the only ones who haven't? I asked. What about that old guy who's always pissed off? That's Mr. Kaufman, Seth said. He won't respond. He told me that me and Heidi were going to hell because we use walkie-talkies and generators. He's a very traditional guy, Ben added. He gives Amish folks a bad name, Seth continued. It's because his kid wasn't interested in the Amish lifestyle. He bailed as soon as he was old enough. Now he takes it out on everyone else. We know Kaufman isn't gonna respond, but David and Sarah would have, Ben said. We have to check on them. Their house was a little further of a walk, so we took Ben's snowmobiles over there. We knocked on the door, but there was no answer. We started looking around the outside of the house to try and figure out where they might have gone. Their horse was in the stable out back. They couldn't have gone far unless they were picked up. I found something, Ben yelled. Seth and I went over to where Ben was along the side of the house. He pointed out the series of footprints. He explained to us that the wind had been blowing predominantly south, so the footprints were visible on the south side of the house right up against the house where not as much snow had fallen. Someone was out here, Ben said. We again tried knocking on the door, banging on the door really. Still no answer. We were all getting pretty nervous and decided to kick the door in. Ben kicked in the door. It only took a few seconds for us to notice the blood. There was blood all over the floor and splattered on the walls. We followed the blood trail down the hallway, continuously, calling out for David and Sarah. The trail led to their bedroom. The door was closed. There was a large number 2 drawn on the door, presumably in blood. We slowly opened the door. What we saw in there was pure savagery. It's difficult to describe. Their hands and legs were bound in rope. They looked like they'd been placed on the bed together. The room was absolutely covered in blood. They had an absurd amount of wounds, cuts, bruises, and even some missing limbs. David was missing 4 of his fingers. His Achilles tendons were both slashed. Sarah's eyes were cut out. The back of their heads were both caved in. Ben noticed what he described as defensive wounds, implying that the 2 were alive throughout most of what happened to them. I can't even imagine the terror they experienced. The 3 of us stood in silence for a moment, almost in disbelief. I've never seen anything close to that horrible. I can't imagine that any of us had. We all tried to catch our breath and regain our composure. That's when it hit me. Annie! I screamed. We gotta go. I quickly explained to Ben and Seth that Annie had heard noises outside the previous night and that my gas can was emptied. At the time it was easy to blame animals or the wind, but after what we saw, I wasn't willing to take any chances. We raced to my house to check on Annie. My heart was pounding every second of the ride over. I jumped off the snowmobile before I'd even come to a stop and flung the door open. Annie was sitting on the couch, talking to Heidi. What's wrong? She asked. Ben came inside and we explained what we knew. Seth was about to run home to check on Heidi, before realizing that she was there with Annie. I called the police while Ben checked the rest of the house. He made sure nothing was out of place and everything was locked tight. I was connected to the police station in the larger town roughly a half-hour drive away. The operator explained that they were stretched thin because of the storm, power outages, etc. She said they would try to send a car over but that fallen trees and whiteout conditions have made it difficult for anyone to get through. Ben suggested that we all ride out the storm at the general store. Annie and I got a duffel bag and packed up any supplies that could be helpful. We grabbed batteries, warm clothes, knives, and other small weapons. Annie and Heidi drove the car over to the store while we followed them on the snowmobiles. We got inside, locked up the doors, and then went to get us all something to eat. There was a few minutes of silence as we all tried to process what was happening. Do you think the people who did that to Sarah and David were outside our house last night? Annie asked softly. I don't know, I said. We're all together now, though. The cops are sending someone. It's going to be okay. What about the Kaufmans? Ben asked. You know Kaufman, Seth replied. He might have done it. You think Kaufman killed them? Ben asked. That little old man and his little old wife? You never know, Seth replied. He always said that we were all fake Amish. Does anyone else have a motive to do something like that? Being an ass doesn't make you a killer, I said. It's pointless to randomly speculate anyway. It was quiet for a while after that. Ben made some food, but none of us ate very much. Ben armed himself with his gun, but he only had one. The rest of us tried to find assorted blunt objects or knives for the time being. Eventually, there was a loud bang on the door. We all jumped up and stood close in the middle of the room. Ben aimed his gun at the door and stood in front of us. I prepared to fling the door open with Ben ready to shoot. With my hand on the lock, I counted down. 3, 2, 1. I whipped the door open, and Ben aimed his gun, only to be met with another gun pointed back at us. It was a police officer. After a tense little standoff, we were able to explain that we were the ones who called. Ben put his gun down before the officer put down hers. She came inside. She introduced herself as Officer Grimley, and we explained everything we knew. We told her that the Kaufmans were the only ones not accounted for. "I'm gonna have to go check on them." "I doubt they want to be checked on," Seth said. "They have a right to know what's happening in their neighborhood," Grimley replied. "We can follow you up on the sleds," I suggested. "No way," Grimley replied. "You don't want to take a snowmobile out in weather like this. There's a ton of fallen trees and visibility is awful." "She's right," Ben replied. "You may know the terrain, but the terrain changes in a storm. You should take a walkie," Seth said to Grimley. "I didn't know Amish people could use these," she quipped. "We aren't all alike," Heidi said. "My apologies," Grimley replied. "Just keep it on this channel," Seth said. "It's the one we all use. We all have one. Careful though, the button sticks." "Call me if you see anything," Grimley said as she prepared to head up to Kaufman's. "I'll try to be quick." We nervously waited behind. We were all very anxious to hear back from Grimley. It was silent in the store as we all waited around the walkie-talkie. As we waited, Ben was using his walkie to cycle through the channels on the off chance that there was someone else in range who might need help. To all of our surprise, he found someone. At first, we could only hear the crackle and some static, but eventually we heard a voice. It was a man's voice, whispering to whoever they were calling. "I see the cop. She's at that White House." All of our eyes widened upon hearing that. Before anyone could say anything, another person responded. "I'll be right there. Don't let her out of your sight." We all started to panic. "We have to tell her," Annie yelled. Seth reached for the walkie to call Officer Grimley. She happened to call him moments before he could say anything to her. "The Kaufmans are okay. Very stubborn, but okay," she said. As soon as she stopped speaking, Seth squeezed the button and screamed that someone was watching her. We waited a minute for a response, but then heard Officer Grimley start talking again without hearing the beep. "You'll be safer if you come with me," she said. We then heard another voice, which we quickly realized was Mr. Kaufman. "We can take care of ourselves," he exclaimed. "What the hell?" I asked. "Oh my God," Seth said with a horrified look on his face. "The button stuck. I told her that it sticks sometimes when you call out." It was clear that he was correct as we listened to Grimley continue to argue with Kaufman about coming with her. A panic ensued once more. "What are we gonna do?" Heidi cried. "We have to help her." Ben started hitting the ringer on the other station to try and interrupt the attackers as Seth continued trying to get through to Grimley on ours. There was still no luck as we could still hear a frustrated Mr. Kaufman arguing with Grimley over the walkie. Shortly after Ben started hitting the ringer on the other station, a voice could be heard. "Cut it out with the ringer," one voice said. "It's not me," the other replied. "Turn it off and stay where you are. I can see you." The combination of fear, anger, and helplessness took over the room. We knew that none of us could make it to Kaufman's house in time to be any help. We weren't even sure if we'd make it at all in our crappy car. It was old and didn't hold up well in the snow, let alone a blizzard. We could only listen and hope. We could still hear Grimley arguing with Kaufman. Their conversation abruptly halted after a banging sound could be heard. "Someone is here," the officer said, still not realizing that the button was stuck on the walkie. Back at the store, we panicked. We continued listening, hoping that the cop and the Kaufmans could hold off the intruders. "I see someone out there," Officer Grimley said. "Stay away from the windows." "Where?" Mr. Kaufman aggressively replied. "I just saw him," she said. "It's hard to see with all the snow whipping around." "Are we in danger?" Mrs. Kaufman asked. "No," Mr. Kaufman shouted. "These punks are gonna regret stepping foot on my property." "There's another one. I see him," the officer exclaimed. "Is there a back door? We could sneak out to my car." "There's no back door," Mr. Kaufman sneered. "I ain't running anywhere." "They're both around the side of the house," the officer yelled. "If we move quickly, we can get to my car." "I ain't running," Mr. Kaufman repeated. "I'm gonna go out there," the officer said. "Stay away from the windows." For a minute or so, we didn't hear anything. We could just hear brief noises as they moved around before we heard Officer Grimley's voice again. "It's stuck," she said, confused. "Let me get it," Mr. Kaufman said, sounding irritated. We could hear grunts and a little banging from over the walkie that we were all now huddled around. After what sounded like them trying to get the door open, Mrs. Kaufman once again spoke up. "What is he doing out there?" she asked. "He's dumping something." "Where?" Grimley asked. Moments later, we heard the officer gasp. I could hear the terror in her voice as she said, "Oh my God. We have to get out of here." It was tough to make out what was happening over the walkie-talkie at first. We began hearing screams and Grimley asked Kaufman again if they had a back door. Before long she seemed to attempt to contact us again, not knowing that we could hear what was happening. All she said directly to us was, "They're burning the house. We have to go up there," and he cried. "It'll take way too long if we can even make it up there in your car," Ben replied. "If the house is burning, we don't even have the supplies to put it out. We'd need my truck, and it's not even running right now. Even if we had it, it would still be a long shot. Rushing up there can only get more people hurt." Annie was angry. I wanted to defend her, but Ben knew a lot more about that type of stuff than me. I also knew how rough the hill leading up to the Kaufman's house got when the weather was bad. It didn't feel good, but we decided as a group to stay put. I'm not sure how much of a decision we really had. I don't know how we could have put out a house fire ourselves. Regardless, the remainder of what we heard over the walkie-talkies will haunt me forever. It was a lot of yelling and panic, the sound of glass breaking, and eventually, crying. I don't want to describe it in too much detail. It's difficult. We knew what was happening, and we were powerless to help. At a certain point, the officer spoke to us directly again. She was at a point where she was aware that she wasn't going to make it. I can't imagine how that feels. She asked us to pass on a message. "This is Officer Allison Grimley. My daughter Connie will be starting high school next year. Please tell her to be strong. Work hard and don't take any shit from anybody. Tell her that I'm sorry I can't help her pick out a dress for winter formal, but that she should still go. Tell her not to put her life on hold because of this. Tell her I love her more than anything, and that I'll always be with her. And to you guys listening, I'm sorry. I wish I could have done more to help you. Just kill these bastards." After that, there was a loud thud. And that was it. We kept the walkie-talkie on for a few more minutes, but didn't hear any new voices after that. We sat in relative silence for a few minutes. Nobody wanted to be the first one to speak. Ben silently walked behind the counter and grabbed a bottle of rum along with some glasses. He began pouring drinks. "I don't think we should do that," Seth said. "We gotta be on our toes." "You don't have to have one," Ben whispered somberly. Seth took one anyway, as did the rest of us. It was a difficult feeling. We really needed some time to process and decompress, but we didn't have time. We needed to be in survival mode. "We have to go on the offensive," Ben said. After a short discussion we found that Ben had one firearm at the store, his hunting rifle. Seth said he had some guns at his house. Other than that, we didn't have much more than tools and blunt objects, as well as an old box of fireworks. We decided that we needed to go to Seth's to get weapons. We couldn't just wait in the store for them to come and burn that down too. We needed to even the fight. Ben suggested that someone stay back at the store because it had the most supplies and we couldn't risk the intruders taking it over. After some debate, Seth and I decided to run to his house for the guns. We took the snowmobiles, not wanting to risk the car. We figured that if the weather calmed down, we might be able to drive out of there at some point. We reached Seth's house without incident. I followed Seth inside as he ran back to his bedroom. It wasn't long before he started to panic. "They've been in here," he said. "Guns are gone. So now they're more heavily armed, and we have nothing. I'm owned." "Wait," Seth replied. He pulled out some boxes from under his bed. After digging through them for a minute, he pulled out a pistol. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." "Just out of curiosity, how many guns are missing and what kind were they?" I asked. "How nervous should we be?" "It's a couple hunting rifles, a revolver. It looks like they got the big one too though," Seth nervously replied. "The big one?" "Yeah," Seth muttered. "It's a pretty powerful assault rifle. Semi-automatic." "Perfect," I sarcastically said. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's not your fault. I replied. "We're outgunned though. We gotta come up with a plan. Let's get back to the store. We've been gone way too long anyway." We made our way back to the store, looking over our shoulders, the whole ride. We couldn't see any sign of the assailants. We got to the store, knocked on the door, then anxiously waited for them to let us in. After an uncomfortably long wait, Heidi opened the door. "They came," she cried immediately as we entered the store, tears streaming down her face. "Where are they?" Seth shouted as he drew his pistol. "They ran out the back," Heidi replied. I yelled out to Annie. I couldn't see her and quickly noticed that Heidi had blood on her hands. Those few seconds felt like forever. I felt a monumental sigh of relief when Annie came walking from the back room. She had blood on her as well and was crying. I ran to her and wrapped my arms around her. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "No," she whimpered. "They got Ben." We followed them to the back room, and there he was, lying motionless on the floor. He was covered in blood. I could see several stab wounds. His shirt had been ripped open and a number 6 was carved into his chest. Seth and I both asked what had happened as we frantically tried to check to see if Ben was breathing, desperately hoping he was still with us. Annie and Heidi both already knew that he wasn't. Heidi explained to us what had happened while we were gone. We all started gathering things we could use as weapons. Annie and I started making that, Heidi said, gesturing toward a collection of buckets, cans, jars, and other, seemingly random objects from around the store. "What is that?" I asked. "Well, we started making some homemade styrofoam napalm," Annie said. "It's easy to make, and it could be really effective if we can set some sort of trap. We also made a couple Molotov cocktails. We got some of the fuses from the box of fireworks and emptied some of the powder from firecrackers. We were hoping there would be something more heavy-duty in there, but it's mostly sparklers and Roman candles." "How did you learn to do all that?" I asked. "Degenerate cousins and YouTube?" She shrugged. "So what happened?" Seth asked. "We heard knocking at the front door," Heidi replied. "We thought it was you, but couldn't tell from the window. We tried yelling out to see if you'd respond, but didn't hear anything. Ben was somewhere near the back when we abruptly heard glass shatter. We heard Ben yelling in pain moments later as we both went for a knife. I followed Annie to the back where we saw a man in a ski mask crouched over Ben. Annie lunged at him and stuck him in the back or shoulder with the knife. He jumped up frantically, trying to pull the knife from his back and quickly ran out the back door. We locked it back up and watched from the window as 2 men got on snowmobiles and drove off that way. Annie barricaded the broken window while I tried to resuscitate Ben, but it was too late. "What's with the 6?" I asked. "I think it's the number of victims," Seth replied. "First couple had a 2 written at the scene, 3 more at the Kaufmans, then Ben Mail's 6. It was an uncomfortable thought. Are they really just doing this randomly? So much horrific violence caused, and for no specific reason?" We had a brief moment of silence for Ben before covering his body with a sheet. We vowed that we would give him a proper burial when this was all over. I held Annie and tried to tell her how brave she was. She now seemed more angry than afraid. "We should get out of here," Annie said as she started packing some of the homemade weapons into a backpack. "I agree," Heidi added. "We can't just sit here. We take all the weapons we can find, arm ourselves the best we can," Annie said. "We drive as carefully as possible without puttering. If they come for us, we defend ourselves. We fight." "So, aside from wrenches and kitchen knives, what do we have for weapons?" Seth asked. We didn't have much. We had Ben's hunting rifle with limited ammo as well as Seth's pistol. We had some knives, large wrenches, a bat, and a tire iron. We had Annie's styrofoam napalm and Molotov cocktails. We also had some low-octane fireworks. We loaded the car and headed off. My knuckles were wide around the steering wheel as I nervously drove into the whiteout conditions. Everyone kept a close eye out of their windows. We weren't moving very fast, but we were moving. The Mennonite Murders. Part 2. The 4 of us tried to catch our breath as I drove into the snowy weather. The roads were awful. We had to move though. There was no way to know when those psychos might attack again. They had already likely killed at least 6 people. David, Sarah, the Kaufmans, the cop, Ben. We were all terrified. We had to stay vigilant. Heidi began sobbing. It was understandable. We'd all been through a lot. Seth put his arm around her and tried to calm her down. "We'll be okay," he said. "What if it's him?" she cried. "It's not," Seth replied in a stern tone. "It's not who?" Annie asked. "Don't worry about it. It's nothing," Seth replied. "It's something you aren't telling us. Why won't you tell us?" Annie asked. Seth continued trying to avoid the question. "I will pull this car over," I shouted. "Really?" Seth asked in a sarcastic tone. "No, not really. Just tell us what's going on." Seth had a look on his face like he was ashamed. He still didn't seem to want to tell us. Eventually, Heidi did though. She began by telling us that they had a son that they never told us about. His name was Jacob. Heidi tearfully told us the story of their young son becoming disillusioned with their lifestyle. She described Jacob's resistance to their faith. He didn't seem to want to be Amish. This problem was exacerbated when a family from the city came to the area for a camping trip. Jacob quickly made friends with their kids. He saw toys and gadgets that he had never seen before. He got to play video games. After that family went back to the city, the last thing Jacob wanted to do was go back to his boring Amish home. Heidi says the problem was that there weren't enough kids in the area. The only other kid that Jacob knew was a boy who lived nearby. The boy was a few years younger than Jacob, and looked up to him. If Jacob didn't want to be Amish anymore, then neither did he. The boy's name was Noah Kaufman, grandson of Mr. and Mrs. Kaufman. One day, the boys took off, Heidi said as tears streamed down her face. "We haven't seen them in 8 years. That's why the Kaufmans had a problem with you," I said. "Yes," Heidi replied. "They blamed us, and who could blame them for blaming us?" "And that's how they knew where your guns were," I continued. "No," Seth aggressively replied. "Anyone could have found those guns. Jacob may have not wanted to be Amish, but he's not a killer." "Seth, I really just need to know one thing," I said. "Even if there's just a 1% chance that he could be your kid, if one of those masked psychos was pointing a gun at Annie and you have them in your crosshairs, are you taking the shot?" "100% of the time," he replied. "Then nothing has changed," I said, unsure if I actually believed it. We rode along for a few minutes in relative silence. I could see for a minute, but then the wind picked up again, blowing the snow around. It was a bigger gust than before, and I couldn't see it all through the windshield. I tried rolling the side window down and popping my head out to see where we were. That's when I heard something in the distance. "Do you hear that?" I asked. They rolled down their windows, and I slowed down a little more. It was faint at first. We all quickly noticed at the same time as the noise grew a little louder. It was a snowmobile. "Oh my God," Heidi cried. "It's okay," Seth replied. "We're ready. Alex, just keep driving. Annie, take the pistol. Everyone try to keep your head as low as possible." Seth aimed the rifle out the window. We were all dead silent as we listened to the sound of snowmobiles slowly getting louder. Then abruptly, a headlight emerged from a path coming out of the woods. Moments later, another one. Before long, we heard a gunshot. Another one quickly followed and hit the back of the car. Seth fired a few rounds out of the back window, but didn't seem to hit anything. The gunshots were quickly becoming more frequent, and I was trying to go as fast as possible without putting us in danger. We could hear bullets hitting the frame of the car, and eventually the back window. The glass shattered, but no one was hit. I sped up a little more, my knuckles as wide as the snow. I tried not to look in the rearview mirrors, but I couldn't help myself. Annie and Seth did their best to hold them off, but couldn't manage to get a clean shot at either of them. We continued to build speed, but they were still gaining on us. They continued firing shots at the car. When one of them hit the tire, I completely lost control of the vehicle. We started to spin, faster and faster. We slammed into a large snowbank near the edge of the woods. Nobody seemed hurt, and we quickly got out of the car on the passenger side that was facing away from the men on the snowmobiles. They had hesitated to approach us at first. They probably figured we were injured in the wreck or just worried we would get the jump on them if they walked up to the car. They were standing at a distance as we all took off toward the woods. They started firing at us as we ran for our lives. Moments before we made it to the tree line, Seth was hit. He went to the ground but quickly got up with my help. It looked like they got him in the arm or the shoulder, but he was bleeding pretty badly. The woods were thick and it was pretty rough terrain. Luckily, Seth and Heidi knew their way around these woods. The masked assailants were in pursuit, but they weren't gaining on us very quickly. They continued to fire shots toward us. I carried most of Seth's weight on my shoulder. Heidi and Annie continuously waited up for us, but I told them to go on ahead. I did my best to motivate Seth to not give up. "We've got this," I told him. "Hungry like the wolf, right?" "Hungry like the wolf," he chuckled. All the music I showed you and that's the only song that stood out to you? I laughed. We gotta broaden your horizons. My horizons are plenty broad. The woods were thick and dense. We managed to put some distance between us and the attackers, so I suggested a quick breather to wrap up Seth's wound. Do you have a shirt or a long sock in your bag? I asked. I have a bandage and peroxide, he replied. That'll work too. I had a light bulb moment as he started looking for the bandages in his bag. I quickly grabbed the coffee thermos out of my bag and held it under his wound. Are you collecting my blood? He asked, confused. Sorry buddy. It was already flowing, I said. I'm thinking that we could use it to lead them in the wrong direction. I stopped filling the thermos when he handed me the bandages. I quickly wrapped a bandage around his shoulder. Moments later, we heard another gunshot, and it sounded a lot closer than before. We gotta move, I said as I helped Seth to his feet. We made our way through the trees and bushes, following Annie and Heidi's footprints. We followed a path that led us to the riverbank. Heidi and Annie were waiting there for us. We have to come up with a plan, I said. Seth's wound is bad. We have a plan, Annie replied. It was good that they had a plan. While looking for my thermos, I noticed that we left the rifle ammo in the car. We kept moving as Heidi broke down the plan. We would walk alongside the frozen river. Heidi told us to be careful because the ice wasn't as thick as it looked and some spots were very deep. She told us that there would be a spot not too far up where the river thinned out dramatically and we could get across. We followed her and we all made it to the other side of the river. Just a little further up where the river widened again, there was a large bank. The bank overlooked the frozen river, and there was enough room on the other side so we'd have cover. This is the spot we chose for our last stand. We could only run for so long, and Seth wasn't looking great. Heidi warned us not to go on the ice. She said it was one of the deeper parts of the river. We laid Seth down, and Heidi checked on his wound. Annie began laying down globs of her styrofoam napalm. She tossed a few pieces toward the middle of the ice. We then heard another gunshot in the distance. They were getting closer. The globs are down, Annie said. If we can lure them to the ice, we'll throw everything we have at them and hopefully they'll retreat. Are you sure that stuff will burn? I asked. Oh yeah, she replied. It's mostly gasoline. It'll catch very easily, and it will stick to whatever it touches. Once those guys are over top of it, I'll start chucking Molotovs while Heidi aims a Roman candle at them. I poured Seth's blood from my thermos near the edge of the woods toward the middle of the ice. I stood on the bank to try and get some closer to the middle. I made a trail of blood leading past the embankment where the other three would be waiting. Then I walked a little further down the river so I could see them approaching. Before long, they emerged from the tree line. I watched them approach from my vantage point. They spotted the blood trail. They began following it. I pointed the pistol toward them as they started walking on the ice. I waited until they were at the spot where the napalm globs were placed. Then I pulled the trigger. My shot missed, but it signaled Annie and Heidi. Annie chucked a Molotov cocktail while Heidi lit the Roman candle, held it over top of the bank, and aimed it toward the attackers. Panic ensued. The Roman candle seemed to disorient them as the Molotov cocktail ignited the napalm globs. It was quickly apparent that one of the men had stepped directly in the styrofoam napalm. He jumped around, trying to put out the fire that was clinging to his boots. His boots and a pant leg were engulfed in flames, and he started stomping. The other attacker wasn't on fire, but he was plenty distracted by the one who was. We all watched as the man stomped repeatedly until abruptly, he fell through the ice. 1 second he's panicking and stomping. The next second, he's just gone. The other attacker quickly backed away from the ice and got to land. He was at the other side of the river looking toward the hole where the other one fell through. He didn't wait long before he retreated. He ran toward the tree line and into the woods. I attempted to shoot at him, but quickly discovered that I was out of ammo. The attacker who fell through didn't resurface. He must have fallen straight in and had the river carry him away from the hole. I could vaguely see him under the ice as I walked back toward the embankment. I grabbed Annie and hugged her tight. Heidi walked down toward the ice. She walked along the side of the river until she could see the man who fell through underneath the ice. As I walked over to see what she was doing, she dropped to her knees and started sobbing. "It's him," she cried. "It's Jacob." You could just barely see his face beneath the ice, but a mother knows. I gave her space. Seth didn't show as much emotion. He just had a look of quiet, immense disappointment. We waited for a while at the embankment. Annie and Heidi changed Seth's bandage and cleaned the wound. As they were finishing up, I heard the sound of a snowmobile starting up in the distance. It seemed that the surviving attacker had given up. We made our way back to the car. I was becoming more and more concerned with Seth's condition. He had lost a lot of blood. Luckily, the car still started. We weren't going to be able to get it out of the snowbank right away, but we could at least warm up and lay Seth down. We all sat there and warmed up for a few minutes. Then, Annie and I began walking back toward our house. We didn't see any sign of the other attacker on the walk back. It took a while, but we made it to the house and were able to call the cops again. There was a long wait before any help arrived. The storm had only recently let up. Eventually, though, help would arrive. Seth ended up needing surgery, but he would live. He and Heidi would have to endure the mental trauma of losing their son, but with time they would start to heal. The local media would refer to the events as the Mennonite murders, ignoring the differences between Mennonites and Amish people in favor of a catchier title. We hadn't heard anything about the other attacker, or if he was caught. We weren't sure if it was Noah Kaufman or someone else. About 2 months passed before things started to feel relatively normal again. Seth was home from the hospital. His arm is still in a sling, but he's slowly getting better. Heidi is trying to be strong. She still has her bad days, but who wouldn't? Annie has been pouring herself into her work, trying not to think about what happened too often. She's been working toward a big promotion. And me. I was numb for a while, but I'm coming around. I've come to appreciate life a lot more than I had before. We had all become a lot more vigilant. So, it had been 2 months since the attacks. Annie and I were over at Seth and Heidi's playing cards on a Sunday afternoon. We had just finished a hand. We were goofing on Annie for running back to the house multiple times to check her email. She'd been waiting to hear whether she got the promotion or not. We took a break from cards as she ran over to check again. "Did you guys listen to any of the CDs I loaned you?" I asked. "I like the Barracuda song," Seth replied. "That's a good one," I laughed. "Just don't break my Walkman," I said jokingly. Suddenly, there was a loud, single knock on the door. It was more like someone punched it. We all got up. I followed Seth as he slowly walked to the door. When he opened the door, there was a man I didn't recognize standing there. "Noah," Seth muttered. It was Noah Kaufman. He just stood there breathing heavily for a moment. Then he pulled a gun from his jacket and pointed it at Seth. "Just take it easy," Seth said nervously. "You took everything from me," Noah said. "He was my only friend. He was the only one who cared for me. You wouldn't let him be himself. Now he's gone. You killed him." "We were only defending ourselves, Noah." "You killed him," Noah screamed. "You were trying to kill us," Seth yelled. "What were we supposed to do?" "Put the gun down, Noah. We can help." "Jacob did want you dead," Noah sneered. "In a way, it was his final wish. I'm here to grant that wish. Diaresis." Bang! A shot abruptly rang out. Noah dropped to the ground under a mist of red. We stood there stunned for a moment before Annie popped her head out from beside the door frame, gun in hand. There was a brief silence before Annie spoke. She said just 4 words. "I got the promotion."